1842. The galley at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado is buzzing after a brutal training block. A team of young Navy SEALs, loud and full of adrenaline, are trading jokes over trays of protein and starch. At a nearby small table sits Rachel Cole, a quiet civilian medical contractor, her short sleeves revealing a mosaic of black ink on her forearms. No color, just simple jagged symbols and strings of numbers. A rookie SEAL smirks, leans over, and scoffs. "Why so many tattoos, lady? Trying to look tough for the boys?" Rachel slowly looks up, her gaze cold and steady. "They're not for you," she says. The galley of a naval special warfare base is a cathedral of testosterone, a place where the air smells like industrial cleaner, steam table vegetables, and high-calorie fuel. It's an environment that vibrates with the low-frequency hum of power and the constant rhythmic clanking of stainless steel trays. For Rachel Cole, 32 years old, it was just another Tuesday evening in a world she had inhabited for over a decade. She had been at the base for 3 weeks as a civilian contractor, a specialist in advanced field trauma and prolonged casualty care. Her job was to teach these young warriors how to keep a brother alive when the world was ending around them, and the dust-off was hours away. But to the men she was training, she was just the doc, a civilian who happened to know a lot about tourniquets, blood volume, and airway management. Rachel moved through the base like a ghost. She wore no rank, no uniform, and offered no stories of past glory during the mandatory social hours. She was efficient, precise, and entirely reserved. In the hierarchy of the teams, where reputation is everything and volume is often equated with experience, her silence was frequently mistaken for a lack of field time. The younger SEALs, still riding the high of their recent qualification and the invincibility of youth, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and mild condescension. They saw a woman who was technically skilled in a classroom, yes, but someone who they believed hadn't truly felt the heat of the brass or heard the specific hollow whistle of incoming indirect fire. What stood out most about Rachel, and what provided the fuel for their jokes, were her tattoos. They weren't the artistic, sprawling sleeves you see in the civilian world, or the flashy Neptunian tridents favored by the new guys. They were small, isolated, and stark. There were sets of numbers that looked like map coordinates. There were dates etched in a simple, blocky military font. There were symbols that looked like unit patches but stripped of their color and flash. Just black outlines that looked like scars. To the uninitiated, they looked like a disorganized mess of scrapbooking on skin. To those who knew, they were a map of the dead. "Look at the tourist vibe over there," whispered Cooper, a 24-year-old operator who thought he knew everything because he'd finished Bud/S and had one training trip to the Pacific under his belt. He was sitting with his squad, leaning back in his plastic chair with the unearned swagger of a man who hasn't seen a plan fail yet. Probably got those at a shop outside the main gate to fit in. Everyone wants to look like a tactical operator until it's time to actually do operator things in the mud. She probably spent a weekend watching war movies and decided she needed to look the part. His teammates chuckled, the sound muffled by the clatter of silverware and the roaring ventilation fans. They watched Rachel as she sat alone, methodically eating her meal. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't seek out conversation. She just observed the room with a calm, rhythmic focus, her eyes scanning the exits and the personnel, with a degree of situational awareness that they were too arrogant to recognize. She was tracking the heartbeat of the base, listening for the subtle shift in the air pressure that usually precedes an emergency scramble. "Hey, Cole!" Cooper called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the mess hall. "You planning on getting a trident tattoo next? You've got enough ink on those arms to fill a library. Does it make the medicine go down easier, or is it just for the Instagram photos? We've got a guy in the shop who does real work if you want to fix those scratches." Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't even stop chewing. She waited exactly 3 seconds, a beat that felt like an eternity in the quiet that followed, then slowly turned her head toward Cooper's table. Her eyes weren't angry, they were level. It was the gaze of someone who had looked at things far more terrifying than a cocky young sailor with a fresh haircut and a loud mouth. "I'm here to teach you how to stop a hemorrhage, Cooper," Rachel said, her voice a flat, resonant frequency that carried under the roar of the air conditioning. "Not to provide entertainment for your dinner. Focus on your tray. You're going to need the energy for the midnight ruck. And right now you're burning too much of it on things that don't help the mission. Arrogance consumes more calories than effort. Remember that." The table went quiet for a moment, the weight of her tone catching them off guard. It wasn't the response of a civilian who felt intimidated. It was the response of a professional who was bored by their nonsense. But Cooper wasn't ready to let it go. He felt the need to re-establish his dominance in front of his peers. He saw her as just another contractor who didn't understand the secret brotherhood. He didn't realize that in the world of the quiet professional, the ones who say the least are usually the ones who have carried the most heavy burdens through the longest nights. If you think people are judged too quickly by appearance, comment, "It's unfair." The tension in the galley didn't dissipate. It curdled. Cooper, feeling the eyes of his squad on him, leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He was looking for a crack in her composure, a way to prove she was an outsider who didn't belong in the sacred space of Coronado. He focused again on her right forearm, where a specific set of numbers was etched near her pulse point. 34.86 north, 69.39 east. "Come on, Rachel," Cooper said, his voice dropping into a mocking, conspiratorial tone that he thought was charming. "I'm just curious. Those tattoos, they have to mean something, right? Or are you just trying to look tactical for the contract? Because around here, we don't really do style without the substance to back it up. We like to know who's standing in the wire with us, and those ink blotches look like a lot of noise without a signal." A few of the other young SEALs smiled, waiting for her to get defensive or walk away. Rachel slowly set her fork down. She didn't look annoyed. She looked weary. She looked at Cooper, then at the rest of the table. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her posture shifting from a relaxed civilian lean into something more rigid, more authoritative. It was the posture of a non-commissioned officer about to deliver a correction that would be remembered for years. "They're not decorations," Rachel said. The simplicity of the statement carried a strange, heavy gravity that seemed to physically pull the laughter out of the air. Sitting at the end of the long table was Senior Chief Miller. Miller was 44 years old with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to have seen every dark corner of the earth. He hadn't joined in the mockery. He had been watching Rachel since she arrived at the base 3 weeks ago. He noticed the way she checked the exits. He noticed the way she never sat with her back to a door. He noticed the specific calluses on her hands that didn't come from a gym, but from handling heavy equipment in the grit of a combat zone. Miller leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he looked at a small, jagged symbol on Rachel's left wrist. It was a silhouette of a mountain range with a single, downward-pointing arrow. To a civilian, it might have been a hiking logo. To Miller, it was a ghost from a past deployment he barely survived. A symbol of a joint task force that had been erased from the official records after a catastrophic operation. "Cooper, shut up," Miller said, his voice low and dangerous, like a wolf growling in the dark. The command was so sharp that Cooper actually physically flinched. "Chief, I said shut it," Miller repeated. He looked at Rachel, his expression shifting from neutral to one of profound, haunting recognition. "That coordinate on your right arm, 34.86 north. That's the Hindu Kush, isn't it? Near the Tangi Valley? And the number above it? That's a bird's tail number, isn't it?" Rachel's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened, reflecting the flickering, fluorescent lights of the galley. She offered a single professional nod. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "And the date below it," Miller continued, his voice barely a whisper now, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his water. "August 6th, extortion 17. The air in the galley seemed to vanish. Every SEAL at the table who knew their history, which was all of them, felt a cold chill run down their spine. August 6th, 2011. The single greatest loss of life in the history of the U.S. Naval Special Warfare community, a Chinook helicopter shot down. 38 lives lost in a heartbeat, a date that was etched in blood into the soul of the teams. It was a wound that never truly healed, only scarred over. The other men at the table began to look at Rachel's arms with a new, terrifying level of scrutiny. They weren't seeing ink anymore. They were seeing a map of trauma and sacrifice. They saw a date from the Battle of Ramadi. They saw coordinates from a valley in Yemen that didn't exist on any public maps. They saw symbols of units that had been disbanded after devastating missions. Each mark was a grave. Each string of numbers was a coordinate of a soul's departure. "They aren't just symbols, are they?" Miller asked, his voice full of a sudden, deep respect that bordered on awe. He realized he was looking at a living memorial, a human testament to the price of the quiet, professional life. Rachel looked down at her arms. She ran a finger over the coordinates of the Hindu Kush. Her hand was perfectly steady, the hand of a professional who had worked in the pitch-black darkness while the world was on fire, and the radios were screaming for help that wasn't coming. She remembered the smell of the ozone and the heavy metallic taste of copper in the air that night. "Each one is a name," Rachel said quietly, her voice echoing in the now silent room. "Or a place where a name was lost. Or a day where the silence became permanent. I was the last person many of them saw. I decided I wouldn't be the only one who forgot where they fell. If they can't come home, I'll carry the map of where they stayed." The rookie Cooper went pale. He looked at the tray in front of him, the arrogance that had filled his chest minutes ago evaporating into a sickening sense of shame. He realized he had been mocking a woman for carrying a burden that he wasn't even qualified to touch. He had been playing in the sand while she was recording the history of the warriors he idolized. If you realize some things carry stories you can't see, comment, "I was wrong." The silence in the galley was now absolute. It wasn't the silence of a pause. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a funeral. Men at the surrounding tables had stopped talking, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. All eyes were on the civilian woman in the short-sleeved shirt who was now the most powerful presence in the building. Even the cooks in the back had stopped their clattering. Senior Chief Miller cleared his throat, his posture now one of a subordinate speaking to a superior, despite her civilian status. "Where did you serve, Cole?" The reports just said, "civilian medical specialist with a high-clearance background." They didn't mention the Night Stalkers. "I was a flight combat medic with the 161st SOAR for 6 years, Rachel replied, her voice steady and clinical. "Then I spent 4 years attached to specialized Tier 1 task forces as an independent duty medic. My job wasn't to pull the trigger. My job was to be the bridge between the X and the dust-off. I was the one who stayed in the dirt when the bird couldn't land. I was the one who held the femoral artery closed with my bare hands while the world turned to gray dust and the extraction window was closing." She looked at the young SEALs, her gaze stopping on Cooper. "The reason I have so many tattoos is because I served with units that did things that will never be in the newspapers. I served with men who walked into the dark and didn't come back. I carry their coordinates so that if anyone ever asks where they are, I can show them exactly where their souls stayed. Because they don't have headstones in the valleys where they fell. They only have the memory of the person who tried to stop the bleeding." She pointed to a small, simple anchor on her elbow. It wasn't flashy. This was for a corpsman named David. He was 21. He died in a compound in Sangin trying to reach a wounded Marine. I couldn't save him. I watched the light go out of his eyes while he was still trying to reach for his medical bag. So I took his last known grid. Now he goes everywhere I go. He still reaches for that bag. She pointed to a date on her shoulder, partially hidden by her sleeve. This was for a pilot who flew into a literal sandstorm to get my team out when the command said it was impossible. He made it, but his heart gave out 10 minutes after we hit the green zone. He didn't have any family left. No one to collect his belongings, so I became his family. I became the one who carries his record of service. The rookie SEAL, Cooper, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. He had spent his evening trying to alpha a woman who had seen more combat, felt more loss, and displayed more courage in a single afternoon than he had in his entire life. He realized that her tourist vibe was actually the ultimate form of camouflage. She didn't need to wear the uniform to carry the weight. She was the uniform. "Chief Miller," Rachel said, turning back to the veteran, "I know your unit was in the red zone in 14. I recognize the unit patch on your shoulder. I was the one on the radio when your lead scout was hit near the ridgeline. I told you I'd keep him breathing until the rotor started turning. I kept my word. I still have the recording of that comlink." Miller's eyes widened. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. He remembered that day. He remembered the voice on the comms, calm, certain, like a lighthouse in a storm of lead. He remembered the woman who had jumped out of the helicopter before it had even touched the ground, running into a hail of fire with nothing but a medical bag and a prayer. "That was you," Miller whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "The pilot called you the ghost because you never stayed long enough for the debrief. You just disappeared into the next bird. We searched for you for months just to say thank you. We thought you were a myth." "I was just the medic, Chief," Rachel said. "I did the job I was trained for, and I added another coordinate to my arm that night. Fortunately, it was a win. That's why that one is on the inside of my wrist near my own heart. It's for the ones who lived. It's the only ink that doesn't feel like lead." The surrounding SEALs were now standing. It wasn't a coordinated effort. It was a spontaneous reaction to the realization that they were in the presence of a legend. They had come into the galley thinking they were the elite, the untouchables. They were leaving with the understanding that the true elite don't need to shout. They don't need to brag. They carry their stories in their skin, their scars, and their silence. Rachel picked up her tray. She didn't look for applause. She didn't look for an apology. She had answered the question. "Experience isn't something you talk about over a burger, Cooper," Rachel said, looking the young man directly in the eye. "It's a debt you pay every single day to the people who didn't get to come home. If you want to be a real operator, start by respecting the silence of those who have already done the work. The loudest person in the room is usually the one who hasn't seen the bill yet." She turned and walked toward the tray return, her back straight, her movements economical and disciplined. As she passed, the men stepped aside, clearing a path like she was a visiting admiral. The lady with the tattoos had disappeared, and in her place was a warrior who had turned her own body into a living cemetery for the brave. If you believe some stories don't need to be explained to be understood, comment, "I owe you." The galley remained silent for long minutes after Rachel left. The clatter of forks and the hum of the air conditioning felt louder than usual. No one looked at Cooper. No one looked at each other. They were all staring at the empty seat where the medical specialist had been sitting. It was as if the gravity of her history had left a physical indentation in the room. Senior Chief Miller sat back down slowly, his hands resting on the table. He looked at his own scars, the physical ones on his arms and the ones that lived in the back of his mind. He had spent 20 years in the Navy, and he had never felt as small as he did in that moment. He felt like a recruit again, standing before a master of the craft. "Chief," Cooper started, his voice cracking with emotion, I didn't know. I was just being a jerk. I thought she was just another contractor looking for a paycheck." "That's the problem, Cooper," Miller said, his voice like cold iron striking an anvil. "You think that because you've got the badge and the gear, you're the only one who's paid the price. You look at a civilian and you see someone to be protected or someone to be mocked. You forgot that the teams don't work alone. You forgot that there are people who walk right beside us, without the guns, without the glory, doing the hardest work there is, the work of cleaning up the mess when we fail. You didn't just disrespect her. You disrespected every man whose name is etched on her skin." He stood up again, his face set in a grim expression of command. "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, you and your squad are going to be at the medical training bay. You're going to apologize to Ms. Cole, and then you're going to listen to every single word she says about field trauma. You're going to scrub the floors of that bay until she tells you to stop. Because one day, if you're lucky, she'll be the one holding your life in her hands. And you'd better pray she thinks you're worth the effort." The next morning, The medical training bay was filled with a different kind of energy. There was no joking. There was no ego. The young SEALs sat in their chairs with their backs straight and their notebooks open. When Rachel walked into the room, she was wearing the same short-sleeved shirt, her memorials on full display. She didn't look at Cooper with resentment. She looked at him with the expectation of excellence. Cooper stood up first. He didn't say much. He didn't offer excuses. He just offered a deep, sincere nod. "Ma'am, I was out of line yesterday. I didn't respect the history. Thank you for being here to train us. It's an honor we haven't earned yet." Rachel offered a small, tired smile. It was the first time they had seen her look truly human, rather than just a technical instructor. "Sit down, operator. We've got work to do. Today we're talking about arterial pressure under fire and the reality of a 3-hour wait for extraction in a hot zone. Pay attention. It's a long way to the Hindu Kush, and the desert doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about your technique." The training that followed was the most productive session the unit had ever had. They weren't just learning medicine, they were learning the reality of the X. They were learning that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the biggest muscles or the loudest voice. It's the one who has looked into the abyss, seen its teeth, and decided to stay there to bring others back. They learned that a calm mind is more lethal than a loaded rifle. By the end of her contract, Rachel Cole was no longer the doc. She was a sister of the unit. They didn't ask about her tattoos anymore because they didn't need to. They understood that her skin was a map of a world they were all trying to survive. They understood that the ink was a promise that as long as she was breathing, no one would be forgotten. They started bringing her small tokens, patches, challenge coins, not as gifts, but as offerings of respect. As she drove away from the base on her final day, Chief Miller and his team were standing at the main gate. They didn't shout. They didn't cheer. They simply stood at attention and offered a slow, synchronized salute. A silent salute to a professional who had seen more than she would ever say. Rachel slowed her car, nodded once, and drove into the sunset, carrying the map of the fallen to the next mission. If you believe respect should come from understanding, comment, "I will live honorably." In our modern world, we are conditioned to look for the loudest voices. We are taught that strength is about how much noise you make, how many followers you have, or how many medals you wear on your chest for the world to see. We judge people based on their first impressions and their outward appearances, often ignoring the extras in the background who are actually holding the foundation of our safety together. We confuse volume with value. But the story of Rachel Cole is a powerful reminder of a deeper, more profound truth. True greatness is silent. It is found in the steady hands and the focused gaze of someone who has stared into the absolute chaos of existence and refused to blink. Real competence doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need to brag about its past or demand respect through volume. Real skill is a debt you pay to the people around you in the moments when they are at their most vulnerable. It is the ability to maintain the calm mind when the rest of the world is screaming. In the military, they have a saying, "Beware the quiet ones." It's not a threat of violence. It's a warning about underestimating the power of a disciplined and focused mind. The people who solve the hardest problems, the ones who hold the world together when the plans fall apart and the machines fail, are rarely the ones seeking the spotlight. They are the ones in the back of the room, observing, learning, and waiting for the moment they are truly needed. They are the invisible pillars of our society. Rachel Cole didn't carry her tattoos to prove her toughness to a room full of strangers. She carried them to honor her burden. She understood that in a crisis, the most dangerous thing isn't the enemy, it's the noise of the panic. She chose to be the anchor. She chose to be the silence. She understood that the weight of memory is heavy, but it is the only thing that keeps us human in a world that wants to turn us into machines. Respect isn't a gift you give to someone because of a title on their office door or a rank on their collar. It's a recognition of the character they show when no one is watching and when there is no reward other than the mission itself. Rachel didn't need the SEAL's approval to know her worth, but her integrity eventually forced them to give it. She taught them that the most elite form of service is the one that seeks no recognition. So the next time you see someone working quietly in the corner, doing the boring or unimportant work with absolute focus and a complete lack of ego, take a second look. You might be looking at an anchor. You might be looking at a hero who has traded their weapon for a tool of healing, but kept the soul of a warrior perfectly intact. You might be looking at the person who will save your life one day. You might be looking at a map of a history you aren't yet qualified to understand. Don't judge the cover of the book. Value the character of the soul, because when the world breaks, it's not the loud ones who hold it together. It's the quiet professionals who refuse to let the formation break. They are the ones who find the silence in the noise. They are the ones who carry the scars of the past so we can have a future. Be that person. Be the calm in the storm. Be the one who carries the memory of the fallen by doing the work of the living with absolute discipline and quiet respect. If you believe some of the strongest people carry their stories in silence, leave a comment and subscribe to The Veteran Story. We tell the stories behind the calm minds that have seen more than they say.